We have heard with our ears, O God, our fathers have told us what work you did in their days, in the days of old. You drove out the nations with your hand, but them you planted. You afflicted the peoples, but them you spread abroad. For not by their own sword did they possess the land, neither did their own arm save them, but your right hand and your arm and the light of your countenance, because you were favorable to them. You are my king, O God. Command deliverance for Jacob. By you we push down our foes. By your name we tread them under who rise up against us. For I will not trust in my bow, neither shall my sword save me. But you have saved us from our foes and have put those to shame who hate us. In God have we made our boast all the day long, and we will give thanks to your name forever. But now you have cast us off and brought us to dishonor, and do not go forth with our hosts. You make us to turn back from the foe, and those who hate us take spoil for themselves. You have made us like sheep for food, and have scattered us among the nations. You sell your people for naught, and have not increased your wealth by their price. You make us a reproach to our neighbors, a scoffing and a derision to those who are round about us. You make us a byword among the nations, a shaking of the head among the peoples. All the day long is my dishonor before me, and the shame of my face has covered me, for the voice of him who reproaches and blasphemes by reason of the enemy and the avenger. All this has come upon us, yet we have not forgotten you, nor have we dealt falsely in your covenant. Our heart has not turned back, nor have our steps declined from your way. Though you have sore broken us in the place of jackals, and covered us with the shadow of death. If we have forgotten the name of our God, or spread forth our hands to a strange God, will not God search this out? For he knows the secrets of the heart. Yea, for your sake we are killed all the day long. We are accounted as sheep for the slaughter. Awake, why do you sleep, O Lord? Arise, do not cast us off forever. Why do you hide your face and forget our affliction and our oppression? For our soul is bowed down to the dust, our body cleaves to the earth. Rise up for our help, and redeem us for the sake of your loving kindness. So, as is customary, what is this psalm about? What is the author saying? Yeah.
Kind of confusion, like why? You've done this for us before. Now you're doing this. So kind of trying to understand their position and why this is happening to them.
Yeah, it's certainly coming from a place of not understanding.
But yet still holding faith at the same time.
Yeah, it's an expression of confidence in God, at the same time confusion about what is happening. In the form, it is a lament, essentially, right? There is a problem, a suffering that they have, and a desire to be rescued from that, a petition to God after explaining their problem. Much like most laments, but different from them, of course. I think this might have been my next note. Yeah, there's a desire to God for save, but the difference is that they don't know why this is happening. A lot of laments will contain the reason for this. We have sinned against you, God. Forgive us for what we have done. Or we turned our backs on you. We've forgotten to do this or that. We have neglected you in some way or done something wrong. And it is a petition to be forgiven and to be rescued from the trouble that they believe has come upon them as a consequence of their actions. Yeah.
I might as well start with a dumb question. I noticed the word hate pop up very strongly there in the first couple of verses. Is this anti-Semitism?
Hate. When you say hate...
They hate us. They hate us.
Okay. Anti-Semitism. So it's kind of a difficult... How do I want to say this? That as a category would not have made sense in their context, I don't think. Boy, this is really going to stray far afield and we're going to risk running into modern politics, but we're going to do it for a moment anyway, certainly. The idea of anti-Semitic attitudes and behaviors in our modern society are less about the religious beliefs of the people involved. For example, if you look at the way that people speak about Jewish people now, it has less to do with their belief in God or their faith in God or their trust in even, say, a different God than my God, right? Whereas in this time and place, it was much more religious and political rather than having an identity as Jews. The modern kind of notions of Jew hatred that have grown up have to do with them as interlopers within society and as a group of people, more racially based, and they wouldn't have had the same attitudes then. They would have hated them, but as people that had possessed a land that formerly belonged to the pagans in the past, or these are people that worship a different God than the one I worship, right? We worship, over here they have the Molech and the Baals and so forth, the Ashtoreth, and they worship one God and they claim that their God is bigger and better than my God. So there's that conflict that exists.
Just wondered if the hatred of them was the reason they were having the suffering.
Yes, though again, I would say that the idea that, again, modern anti-Semitic people, right, people that don't like Jews, you can be completely an atheist and still think the Jews are terrible, right? The idea that people hate Jews now for the same reasons I don't think applies. It is true that there is hatred of the Jews that is being expressed here, that the people around about them despise them, but I don't think it had the same sources as the people that have that attitude now, by and large, at least within our society.
That's enough, thank you.
Yeah, okay. Don't want to go too far and too deep on it, because again, this isn't, it's not a modern political theory class, yeah. They were confused about what it was that they had done, which is why this lament is separate or kind of distinct from a lot of the other ones. And it is reminiscent, again, as the last couple Psalms have been in some ways, of the book of Job, where, again, in Job, as we had a wonderful class about it for a few weeks, Job is not understanding why this has happened to him. But Job is still justified in the fact that he does not accuse God of dealing with him unjustly or being unfair. In the same way, in this psalm, we don't see the Israelites, through the person of the psalmist, speaking on their behalf or speaking as the king, perhaps if this is written as a psalm for the king to use, saying that God has not treated them fairly. It is simply a question of, we don't understand what's going on. As far as I know, as far as we can tell, we've done the right things. And it's almost not even a request for an explanation, merely for God to either reveal the sin that has caused them to do this, there's a hidden sin, or for him to relent and to go ahead and begin acting in their behalf and to redeem them. But in neither case is there an accusing finger pointed at God, condemning him in any way for something that he has done or not done, neglected to do. Yeah?
I think deep down inside, especially back in these days, deep down inside, they know that there's a plan for them and for everybody, and they have that sense in them, so they'll keep taking the punishment. As even now, as strong Christians, we'll keep taking the punishment because we know that there's a plan for us at the end or later on. And this is why this is happening, because it's written, and there's an understanding of that. So maybe that helps keep your faith still strong in what you do.
Yeah, boy, this is, there's a little bit of this at the end. They get into more of this at the end where they begin expressing that confidence. I would quibble with that only slightly in that I think that instead of believing that everything has to be an integral part of the plan that God has laid out, I believe it's more that they have an ultimate faith that God's will and desires are accomplished, regardless of any efforts that are made to frustrate them.
But yet that's part of the plan.
Yeah. Again, the part that gives me any hesitancy about this at all, and maybe this isn't what you're saying, it's my misunderstanding, is that sometimes I hear people express that everything that happens to them happens for a reason, right? That it is a desirable and important reason that is part of what God intends. And I don't think that's true. I think that in some sense, we can do things that are contrary to what God wills us to do. We sin and we fall short and we do things that in fact God does not want to happen, right? But God is not controlling us to the degree that he manipulates every element of our lives. He allows freedom in what we choose, but ultimately he is so powerful that try as we might to do what he does not want or to prevent his goals from being accomplished, he can always have the ends he desires come to pass. Right? And Jonah, I think, is an excellent example of this in some sense, that I don't think that, and we get into Calvinism and we could have long wrangling conversations about free will, but that's not what I want to do this morning. Not what I prepared for. Jonah tries to do other than what God wants. He flees to go to the other end of the world away from where God is sending him. But in the end, God's will is accomplished and Jonah goes to Nineveh and preaches to the people of Nineveh. Right? Whatever Jonah's desires were, whatever his efforts were to thwart the stated end of God, Jonah go to Nineveh and preach to the people, didn't work. Right? He could have gone straight there, saved himself a lot of time and trouble and a very unpleasant experience in the belly of a whale. But he didn't, and it didn't matter because he ultimately ended up being where God wanted him to be and doing what God wanted done. God ultimately is not thwarted despite the fact that we are free to choose our own choices. Right? Pharaoh was there. I'll get off this soapbox in a second. Pharaoh and the Israelites, Pharaoh was there to demonstrate the glory of God. And I would argue that he had a choice. He could have let them go at the beginning. He could have acknowledged the sovereignty of the Israelite God, given glory to God, and let the people go. And when he declined that, he became an instrument to show the glory of God through the destruction that was wrought upon in Egypt because he was intransigent. In either case, the people were freed, God was glorified and magnified, and Pharaoh simply suffered because he would not accept that was going to happen. He tried to thwart God and was himself crushed. But God could not be thwarted despite whatever the choices Pharaoh made. Anyway, all right. The psalmist is arguing that Israel has not deserved the suffering that they're receiving. That he does not know of anything that means they should have had this happen. But again, he does not blame or point fingers at God in doing so. Verse 22 of this psalm is actually quoted by Paul in Romans 8:36. We are as sheep to be slaughtered, we suffer death all day long. I think I got that backwards. We suffer death all day long as sheep to be slaughtered. So this is a psalm that gets quoted in the New Testament, used as a way of Paul talking about the people of God, once again, suffering in ways that they do not deserve because they have their faith in God and trust that ultimately things will come right. The superscription can easily be for the sons of Korah instead of. I don't know if we noticed it says of in a lot of texts as a superscription. The preposition there could go either way. It could mean either thing. So it could be for them to sing as part of the assembly. It's this case in a lot of superscriptions for psalms. This psalm is likely from before the exile. It speaks of them as a nation suffering defeats in combat. They are mentioned to be innocent. There's no mention of the temple being destroyed or desecrated as would have happened before the exile, so as well right before it happened. But there's nothing to tell us exactly when this was, which king, which time it was that this is referring to. And Israel was defeated a number of times in different times and places. So it begins by speaking of the stories of them coming into the promised land and speaking of their familiarity. Right? These are the stories that our forefathers told us of how God brought us into them. The phrase drove out into is much more literally to be understood dispossessed. It is the negative form of possessing something. It speaks of taking the possession of it away from the peoples that live there in the promised land and then giving it to the Israelites, using the metaphor of planting them in the land, making it permanent. They put down roots and it becomes their own. Ooh, that was several presses of the button. And then they continue this. The word is often translated in a lot of translations as flourished. It's actually a metaphorical word here. They have a word that means flourish, specifically for them to be healthy and to grow. But they specifically use the term spread abroad, right? To spread out, a word for the growing of like vines growing across something, or a tree branches spreading out. Probably to continue the metaphor of the planting that they use there in verse 2. So they continue that idea of the permanence and the growth within the land, speaking of their past and their history, recapping or reiterating what God has already done for them and how they have been under his protection. Acknowledging as well in verse 3, importantly, that this was God that did these things. They did not accomplish the taking of the promised land. This was not something the Israelites did on their own. They did not do it by their own strength. They were able to do it only with the power of God. It speaks of this in multiple ways. He continues to repeat for emphasis and to reiterate these kinds of ideas, speaking of the sword, the arm, the right hand, and the light of his face, the countenance of God. Really pushing the point home that they understand that whatever success, whatever victory they have is from God, not through their own strength. I particularly like this idea, the idea of the light of his countenance. And I don't know, maybe this is just a weird quirk for me, but I really like the idea that all it requires for God to be able to do things for you is to look at you. Right? The power of God, I think, is summed up in a neat and interesting way by speaking of the light of his face, the beauty of his expression, right? That all he has to do is turn his attention to you, and that is sufficient. It was reminiscent to me of the beginning of the Bible, right? In Genesis, where creation is accomplished. How? What does God do to actually create the universe?
He spoke it into existence.
He speaks and it is done. Yeah. And this is one of those ideas that is very, very powerful to me for some reason, metaphorically. But I also think of the centurion in the Gospels who comes to Jesus for help, for healing for he was his servant in his case. At any rate, he asks for healing and Jesus says, fine, I'll go with you. And he says, no, you don't have to do that. He says, I understand how power and authority works, and you can just say, have it be done, and I know it'll happen. He says, I understand, because all I have to do is say, I want a thing done, and people will go and do it. And you can do this as well. That idea of power and authority being wrapped up in not needing to actually exert yourself, but to simply wish for a thing to be done. And God being the ultimate expression of that power, ultimate expression of this authority, that he simply has to turn his attention, his favor on you, and you are blessed. You are successful. You are victorious. It's a wonderful idea. I very, very much taken with that. Verse 4 has an imperative word. An imperative word, of course, is, much like the word used, command. It's like an order. Right? The way that I say to my kids, I say, pick up your room. I didn't ask them to pick up their room. I told them to pick up their room. I use the imperative form. And they use that when speaking to God in verse 4. A lot of translations will shift this. In the second half, for example, my NIV says, who decrees victories for Jacob. The idea of it being that God commands these victories. But the literal translation of this is, command victory for Jacob. We've talked about this before, but it's been a while. Where does the psalmist get off telling God what to do? How should we understand this use of the imperative form of the verb here?
It's also a sense of asking.
How does it become a sense of asking? Or what does it convey? I think you're right.
Yeah.
It's still actually a request.
It's the faith that knows he can do it.
He does have faith in God, indeed that God will do this, I think. But I think it's intended to convey a specific thing. It's intended to convey urgency, right? And we can see this in the way that we speak to God sometimes in times of great distress, right? If we were to fall into the water and be drowning, we shout, "Save me!" We use the imperative form to ask to be saved, to express the deep need, the immediate urgency of our problem. And I think in the same way the psalmist is using the imperative here, not because he thinks he can tell God what to do, but as a way of saying, this is how badly I need help. As a way of expressing that urgency and deep need in a way that is easily understood by both the hearer and by the speaker, right? Not that he thinks he can tell God what to do. Again, he's not commanding God, but he's using the imperative as the way that a person drowning would use this imperative. As a person about to fall off a cliff, as a person in deep, deep danger, would use it to say, I need help right now. I think there's another instance of this a little bit later on as well. 4 also has an interesting shift. It goes from speaking of we and our. We have heard with our ears, O God, planted our fathers. You crushed the peoples and made our fathers flourish. In 4, it becomes, you are my king and my God. It goes from the collective first person, we, to the singular, me. And it's going to bounce back and forth. Can I put that in my next note? Yeah. 5 goes back to we. Through you we push our enemies. But then 6, I do not trust in my bow. Why go back and forth between these two forms? Between the singular and the plural?
Could be going back to the very beginning of Aaron's stories that their fathers told them they're all one peoples. He's in that peoples that have come through that entire line.
Yeah, it's certainly, speaking of there's the identity of the corporately, as well as individually, and remembering back to what God has done for them both as a group and individually. There's the potential as well that this is a liturgical form that we don't commonly use. Right? This is much more common for something that you would see in maybe a Catholic service, or I'm not familiar with enough of them really, Lutheran possibly, where you have one person at the front doing one set of phrases and the congregation doing a different set. Right? That if this is intended and written for the king to lead this as a plea for God to give him and the nation victory in battle, then he may be the only one speaking certain lines, and thus they are written from the singular perspective. And then the ones that are supposed to be spoken corporately, everyone together, are given the we. Equally, it could be intended that each person is supposed to make parts of this personal. Right? That we can say, yeah, we remember, right, the stories that we heard, and we remember what you did for our forefathers. We know those stories have been handed down. But that it is important for each person to personally take responsibility for saying that you indeed are King and God. That I can't just hide in the crowd. I have to say that and make that the first person singular pronoun to say that I, Ryan, believe this to be true. Especially, and again, I do not trust in my own strength. I'm not going to trust in the strength of the people around me or myself, but each person needs to make explicit in verse 6, right, that I am not going to put faith in my own power. So these are, it could go either way. It could be any one of these things, combination of these things. It could be both that as well as the difference between these. Kings in particular could be very susceptible to this temptation to arrogance, right? We see David doing this when he commands the census of Israel, which is forbidden, wanting to know how many fighting men were there and how strong the country was, which was forbidden for them to do. That temptation to understanding power as belonging to him, him being the king, existed for all the kings, so it could easily be as well just for the king to say. Listening to verses 4 and 5, God has not only provided victory in the past, but recently. Through you we push back our enemies, through your name we trample our foes. They have been victorious and then ceased being victorious. I already said that point. Verse 8 concludes the first 10 lines of the psalm. There are a couple verses here, I think verse 3 in particular, that are a bit longer verses that actually encompass more than one line of the psalm. There are 10 lines in the first section of the psalm speaking of their past and what they have already done. To this point, they have not yet spoken of their problem. So if you read through these first 8 verses, it speaks of what they have learned in the past. It speaks of their own success, knowing that it comes from God, and their faith and trust in Him. Right? In God we make our boast all day long, and we praise your name forever. To this point, there's no problem. The next section has 8 lines. And then there'll be 6, and it concludes with 4. It diminishes as it goes along, each section getting shorter and shorter. It forms, figuratively, a shape as well. I don't know that this has any significance other than just a poetical kind of form or something that may have been pleasing aesthetically, but it was interesting. It shifts down 10, then 8, then 6, then 4 as the psalm goes along, and there's a subject change at each point. Did I see? I thought I saw someone's hand. I want to. Okay, maybe not. 9 begins the lament. Israel has suffered defeat, and it has been a particularly bad defeat. What has happened to Israel? What is the nature of this defeat? People have been taken captive. Yeah. What else?
Completely dispersed.
Not only captive, but they have been taken away. Yeah. Sent off to other parts of the world. Captured and taken to other nations. What else? Their land is plundered. They had to retreat. They didn't just simply suffer a defeat and fail to conquer. They had to give up ground.
Not by soldiers, right? I mean, not just by reading this, I figure soldiers, but I forget which time this is, but it's like soldiers have invaded Israel, trying to conquer the lands.
Yeah, again, it's a little unclear whether they were invaded or whether they've lost a battle, but regardless of which it was, they have given up ground. They retreat in the face of the enemy. They had people captured, their land, their own land was plundered, people were taken away, right, and sold off into other nations, it appears. Right? God is still praised as being the source of victory as we go through this section, but they have suffered a terrible reverse. Yeah, again, it's probably not as late as that, as late as Rome or something like that, but it is some other foreign power, yeah, 100%, has brought destruction both into their own land. Again, this is not them going out and attacking the Assyrians and simply not failing to gain victory. They have been driven back and actually suffered losses within their own territory, which is a big and significant thing. 11 and 12 speak of prisoners, as we talk about prisoners captured and taken away. And this is the first instance of being devoured, being like sheep. You gave us up to be devoured like sheep and have scattered us among the nations. You sold your people for a pittance, gaining nothing from their sale. This is figurative language. No one is actually paying God anything. God is not literally selling anyone. But it is saying there is no gain. Nothing has accrued to the glory of God in what has happened. Why would he say it that way? Why is he saying it? You do not gain wealth. You do not gain anything from the sale of your people.
I think his spirit's really torn apart.
Yeah, he's certainly very, very upset. This is of a piece, I think, with the theme of this particular lament as well. Is there a way in which God, let's look at it from the other side maybe, is there a way in which God does gain from the sale of his people?
Yes, if you use it metaphorically.
Okay, how so?
Preach his word, if you tell people about Jesus and what he's done for you. That's a way of selling.
I think in this case, it's not about them going out to do that. I think in speaking of there being the potential from the gain of the people being defeated and scattered is if they have sinned. Because God is the only one to whom there is glory given, right? He deserves all glory and honor. And when he is defied, when he is disobeyed, when the people sin against him, God gains further glory through punishing that sin. Right? That those who defy him are not allowed to do so with impunity. That when the people turn their backs on him, they suffer because they have broken faith with God. And God does not permit that to be done without retaliation, as you could say. I mean, retaliation is not really the right word there, but that there are consequences to defying the God of all creation. But what he is saying here is that they have not done anything wrong. He says, we don't understand why this is happening. We have not broken faith with you, God. And so now, we don't understand. You don't seem to have gained anything by allowing us to be defeated. He understands. Had we broken faith with God, had we sinned against what you wanted us to do, had we turned aside to follow other gods, then yes, allowing us to be defeated in battle would be proper as a way of restoring your own glory or to magnify your own glory as who you are, the one who gives victory and deserves honor. But he doesn't understand. It's further expressing, I don't understand what's happening. I don't know what's going on. It's further confusion on the part of the writer as to what's taking place. Yeah?
What is your analysis of what time frame this took place? Is this David writing this about events that took place during his tenure or his lifetime, or is he looking back into Hebrew history and writing about past events that he's aware of through historical writing?
I think it's certainly contemporaneous to the writer. I don't know that the writer is David in this case. Yeah, there are people who want to try and put dates on this. Some of them put it all throughout the period of the kings. Some of them, like Hezekiah, being his time. Some people go earlier. The general idea, we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, is that it's pre-exile because of the lack of mention of the temple being cast down or broken in any way. And then the fact that this is a nation that understands itself as being right with God. Right? That this is not some, because after the exile, post-exile, or even during the exile, they understood that this was punishment for their failure to follow God. And in this psalm, they're arguing that arguing is maybe strong, they're expressing that they don't think that they have turned away. And this is confusion at why this has happened if they are still faithful. So it could be David, it could even be Solomon, it could be one of the subsequent descendants of Solomon who, having turned back to God and done what was right, is questioning, why is this happening? Yeah, but it's difficult to say with certainty.
And if it was one of those later ones, it could be in post-exile.
Yeah, the post-exile really, there's not much where the kings were very much in control of Israel. They were pretty subservient to most of the other nations, even after the Babylonian exile. It would have had to precede it by a number of years if they were going to still, again, the verses 4, 5, 6, 7 tend to indicate that this is a king who has had victory in battle in the past. Speaking of things that he and the people have done successfully to fight their enemies. And so it tends to put it, I would say, earlier rather than later, but that's awfully vague. It's a big time period. Yeah. So I'm going to jump ahead here. 13 through 16, to finish this, reiterates the ways in which they are shamed by their enemies. And it speaks of, essentially then, that this is, I think by implication, something that God would want to avenge. That his people are put in a shameful place. And that the shame on them, particularly if they have not defied God, reflects on him as well. And this becomes part of the argument at the end, where they argue for God, or they ask God to then redeem and to save them for his own sake. Which I'm gonna zip ahead here. Suffer, faithfulness. In 20 and 21, they acknowledge that they could not hide sin from God. This is not something that is possible for them to do. And this reminds me of Achan in Joshua 7. We remember the story of this. This is immediately after the fall of Jericho. They move on to the next city, smaller and less significant. I never know how to pronounce it properly. It's just the letters A and then the letter I. Is it AI? Is it I? I don't know. But they fail in this, and it's revealed that Achan, during the sack of Jericho, has taken things for himself he ought not to have taken and hidden them. They discover his sin by casting lots after God says, someone has done something wrong, and this is why you have failed, and I'm not with you at this moment. And so this idea in 20 and 21, I think, is a way of saying, expressing to God the desire to know what it is. That if there is a sin that the people are not aware of, that the king does not know about, that it be revealed so that it can be corrected. They acknowledge, again, this is, I think, an acknowledgement of the justice of God. Right? They don't understand why they have been defeated, but there is a realization that sin is sometimes hidden, and then it must be sought out and gotten rid of. 23 begins the final section, calling on God to save them. We have the imperatives return, awaking, arising, and the return of the countenance, that God hides his face. The very last bit, I'm out of time, I'm over my time, is God is implored to save not for them and themselves, but for his own sake. Right? Rise up and help us, redeem us because of your unfailing love. That God has made himself known to be a faithful God, a loving God, a God who does not abandon his people. And it is not because of themselves that they wish, or that they ask God to do this, but as a being true to his own nature. that God, through saving them, will create more glory and honor for himself by demonstrating to the world that he is who he says he is, that he is faithful to what he says. It brings full circle this idea that, as they said at the beginning, what God did for them, they did not do, right? The conquering was not their own hands, not their own power, not their own honor and glory, but all from God. At the very end, God will do it again, not because they are so great as a people, but because God is so great as a God. All right, I'm really out of time. Any burning comments or questions before you really got to spit out? Okay, thank you. You've been very patient. I appreciate it very much. We will talk some more next week.